And now on to our featured reader. Many of you know that Elizabeth Alexander was raised in Capitol Hill, and I'm sure many of you have known her since those days, and that she returned here a few years ago to recite her poem, Praise Song for the Day, at the first inauguration of President Barack Obama. A few of you also probably know that she has published 6 books of poems, one of which was the finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, as well as 2 books of essays, and that she is now the Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of African American Studies and the Chair of the African American Studies Department at Yale University. Instead of going further into her accolades, I would like to describe the first time I heard Elizabeth read many years ago at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Elizabeth was born in Harlem, and she couldn't have seemed more at home at the reading. She was personable, direct, and engaging. Whoops, you know what? I realized I have the wrong, this is an earlier version of this.
Shit, stop.
My language. Okay. I was like, I did that better in my new version.
Then I should tell you, I'm actually Michael Durda.
All right, you're now going to see how I did it better in this version. As I said, Elizabeth was born in Harlem, and she couldn't have seemed more at home at the reading. She read as if she was speaking to each and every audience member as a friend, a confidant, a compatriot. She also surprised herself by crying while reading a poem about her son. And though I had by that time gone to a lot of readings, I don't think I'd ever seen such a direct and powerful connection between intelligence and emotion in a poet and poem. And she read poems that displayed an impressive formal and thematic variety, from the personal and narrative to the highly lyric to the historic and sequential. I thought to myself, this is the kind of adventurousness and seriousness and strength and generosity that one needs to be a great poet, and as a great poet, a great citizen of the world. With poems that, according to poet laureate Rita Dove, quote, bristle with the irresistible quality of a world seen fresh, end quote, Elizabeth has served as a model of integrity and insight for me ever since. Please join me in welcoming one of the leading voices of the neighborhood, the city, and the country, Elizabeth Alexander.
Thank you. Oh, I moved it away, sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you for coming. It's such an honor to be a part of this. As Rob said, we wanted this series to be fairly casual, fairly intimate, and wide-ranging. We wanted to get a working poet and talk to her for an hour, a little longer than you usually hear at a book reading, but less formal and technical perhaps than you'd have in a poetry journal. We're not exactly sure how it will work. Well, this is our first. My chair and our chairs look much more comfortable than yours, so I hope an hour doesn't seem like a trial to you. We limited it to just 100 tickets. The downside of that was that people were turned away. The upside is that it's fairly intimate, which is nice. We will not take questions at the end. Instead, we want you to talk to her at the little party afterwards. See how that goes. I hope that's nice. I think it will be. First things first. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Now, your first job was at the Washington Post. What made you turn against the light?
You veered from your prepared text. We discussed all of this earlier, and that was just a throwaway. But actually, I did have a moment. I knew that I wanted to write. I thought I wanted to be a journalist. I liked the idea of being sent out into the city that I love so much,
yes,
and having to talk to people and having an excuse and a reason to go and talk to people and to go into different neighborhoods. I worked at the Post in a summer before my senior year and then afterwards. So it was very wonderful, but the truth is, I also soon felt the will to embellish. I mean, it really is true. I began to think about ways that stories could be made even better, that perhaps that red coat might actually be orange. And I never did that, of course, but...
In the Post.
In the Post.
Yes.
But it really did, it became very clear to me where the margins were. and that the margins were containing me too much, and that wasn't the kind of writer that I wanted to be, that I wanted to be an imaginative writer. And then my parents are here, Clifford and Adele Alexander. And my mother, I've told this story before, but and my mother's friends are here, so you all will know this is so Adele. Adele brought up graduate school and said, well, you know, I know you said I graduated from college and said I am finished with education, that's it, I'm done. And she said, well, you know, there's that poet that you love so much, Derek Walcott, and I noticed that he was teaching at Boston University, and what if you just wrote for that application? And what if you just filled out that one application and see what happens?
Yes.
And in her words that oft repeated, I use them with my children now, create an option for yourself.
Oh, yes, that does sound
very,
parental.
very good words. So long and short of it was, and at that point I had written fiction, but so I applied with stories. I didn't have poems, but I wanted to be with Derek Walcott and learn from him. He was a god to me. And so I got in and I went, and I became a poet.
Nice, nice. I'm really glad you did, of course. You're not an easy person to prepare to interview. I knew your poems, but as I got into the poems, then I was drawn back to the essays. Those drew me into lots of different subjects, many more than I expected to find, and I felt as though I was preparing to interview 6 different people, which is fascinating. So we're going to have a pretty wide-ranging discussion here. Let's start, though, with the inauguration. Mm-hmm. And the first time you read a poem in front of 2 billion people. A few months ago, we all listened to Richard Blanco read his poem, One Today, and I bet you were the only person who understood what he was going through.
Yes.
It's an honor. It's a burden.
Yeah, it's not like anything else. And you would think people always ask me if I was nervous. And it's a kind of nerves, but it's a unique kind of nerves because you have to do it. I mean, once you're there, you can't not do it. So it's really not productive to let those nerves get the better of you. One has pride. But also, I think that in a way, something that's beautiful about an audience without boundary.
Yes.
Is that you actually can't overthink it. You could never possibly know who you were talking
I
to.
see.
So I felt that it brought me closer to what the poem itself needed to do in a kind of a pure way.
The audience was so big, you just put it out of your mind.
Well, they were there, but I didn't. They weren't in my head. They weren't on my shoulder.
How do you prepare for an assignment like that? How do you prepare a poem like that?
Well, the way that I did it was, you know, I didn't want to move too far away from how I made poems all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it wasn't the time to try a new methodology, that I would just do as I always did, which is usually kind of a circling and a listening and a kind of a, you know, a bit of a call comes around where you're just a little bit more, you know, acutely listening.
But you had a deadline, which you, I suppose,
I
rarely
had
have.
You never have. No one's ever waiting for the poems. You know, I mean, that's so. No, there's no deadlines. It's anti-deadline in
Yes.
poetry.
But this time,
yeah. So also, I read a lot, as I usually do, and then I stopped reading as I usually do, and then just hammered away at it over and over and over again.
did you have to write 3 the way Blanco did, or you
No,
wrote 1 and you read it?
that's right.
Could you read some of it today?
Yes. And I read, you know, so today there is an immigration reform rally. That's what has some people from being here. And so they asked me to read today. And it was wonderful to go back to that space and to find that I read this in English and in Spanish because I worked with a former student on a translation of the poem when it was published because I wanted it to be available in Spanish for the millions of people in the States, not for
Right.
importation for whom Spanish was their first language. So what was great was to discover that it does have life and application
Yes.
beyond the time itself. So praise song for the day. Each day we go about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes or not, about to speak or speaking. All about us is noise. All about us is noise and bramble, thorn and din, each one of our ancestors on our tongues. Someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere with a pair of wooden spoons on an oil drum with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, "Take out your pencils, begin." We encounter each other in words, words spiny or smooth, whispered or declaimed, words to consider, reconsider. We cross dirt roads and highways that mark the will of someone and then others who said, "I need to see what's on the other side. I know there's something better down the road." We need to find a place where we are safe. We walk into that which we cannot yet see. Say it plain that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices they would then keep clean and work inside of. Praise song for struggle, praise song for the day. Praise song for every hand-lettered sign, the figuring it out at kitchen tables. Some live by love thy neighbor as thyself, others by first do no harm or take no more than you need. What if the mightiest word is love? Love beyond marital, filial, national. Love that casts a widening pool of light. Love with no need to preempt grievance. In today's sharp sparkle, this winter air, anything can be made, any sentence begun. On the brink, on the brim, on the cusp. Praise song for walking forward in that light.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Very lovely. How did that assignment change your life?
Big time. Here's the thing. The elders will tell you that you gotta get ready and you gotta stay ready. That you don't know what life will hold for you,
yes,
and that it's important to be prepared. Or that's what I was always taught. And so what was nice was when suddenly there was all of this attention and all of these very different kinds of venues than were usually interested in hearing me read or hearing me speak, asking me to do that.
Right.
It was nice to think, well, I can do what I've always done, which is talk about American poetry, talk about its diversity, talk about poetry itself and its importance and what's found there, talk about African American culture and African American studies, read poetry, but instead of doing it to 6 people, now there are a lot of people. And so I didn't have to reinvent myself in any way.
Nice.
But I just had to kind of keep my wits about me.
Yeah, sure. One of your poems in the Antebellum Dream Book includes this ironic line, "I am from D.C., therefore responsible."
Yes. I mean, hearing today,
responsible?
there are all these people in the streets, and well,
Yes.
that's how it is. When you grow up in Washington, D.C., and when you grow up in this neighborhood,
Yes.
you grow up seeing politicians come and go, and people come in and out in a beautiful way with, the mall available for people to say, this is what we believe, and to
Right.
make a visual demonstration of that.
You are responsible. You are a responsible person, or you are responsible for others?
I think responsible for others. So I think there's a sense here of civicness. That's also a part of my family as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about your family background?
Well, they're right here. These people.
And
And
you had some contact with very powerful people.
the ones who I lived with. Yes. But my mother and my grandparents were in various ways always committed, and my father to justice, and to, in particular, moving forward opportunities for people who were denied opportunities.
Your father
for
worked for
women.
Lyndon Johnson and for Carter, is that correct?
And for Lyndon Johnson and for Carter, and in all of his work has been committed to creating opportunity and making things more fair, plain and simple. And so, that just shows you, I think, one of the things that you always said, Dad, was you never know who's listening, so speak up. Say what you have to say. Don't be silent when something that shouldn't be happening is happening. So that sense of responsibility that you can't let something unjust happen and not in some way address it. So I think that in the poems, sometimes the way that comes to bear is in thinking a lot about history.
Yes.
And my mother's a historian, and this idea that there's so much in our past that hasn't been explored, that hasn't been
Yes.
documented, that's been told from other angles, and that the arts are a way that you can sort of illuminate some of that.
And many of your most famous poems give voice to people that didn't have a voice at the time.
Yes, or for whom we don't necessarily have a written record, or who have not been the primary subjects of history.
Right. You were growing up in D.C. in the 60s?
Yeah.
There were some angry poets at that time.
I think there are always angry poets. I mean,
Okay.
who are you thinking of?
Talk about that. Talk about. You don't seem angry to me at all. You seem very determined.
I'm determined. I'm angry about a lot of things. You can't live in the world and not be angry about a lot of
good.
things.
That's good.
But you know, one has one's methods, right?
Who speaks for us today? Are we too balkanized to have a poet that speaks for us? Are we too split?
No, I don't think so at all. I actually think American poetry right now, it certainly used to be, if you look at literary anthologies, for example, most American poetry anthologies used to be literally completely segregated. I mean, if you went and looked through them, you would see anthologies filled with not only white writers, but only white, almost all male,
Yes.
almost all educated in a certain way,
Yes.
almost all having contact with New England at one point or another.
Some of them, yes, some of them were fighting for civil rights and social justice.
But my point being that I think that what is very, very different now in the American poetry scene is that the poetry organizations like the Poetry Society of America has changed tremendously
Yes.
in its programming, in its award giving, and the Academy of American Poets, all of the major organizations are doing much more to recognize the diversity of voices, which I think we're living in extraordinary times for American poetry, and now in publishing and in teaching and in poetry organizations, you're starting to see that recognized.
Right, which is a great thing.
It's a
great
fantastic thing.
You studied ballet for years in D.C.
Where did you find out that I studied ballet? So that's a Capitol Hill story. I studied ballet for years, and it was the most important thing I did at St. Mark's Church,
okay.
which still has a
Yes.
wonderful dance school. And that was my formative art and discipline.
You have a poem called Neonatology, in which there's a great line, "Birth is like jazz." I love that.
Unpredictable.
To what extent did all those years of moving to music affect your poetry today?
I think very much, actually. I think that, first of all, having a discipline,
Yes.
having something that you attend to
But
regularly.
it's so physical.
Yeah, but I mean, the brain lives in the body, and I think also there is something wonderfully no excuses about ballet, which I
Yes.
think you can't be a good poet if you even give yourself an inch. You can't. And similarly, you can't. I mean, not if you want to be good at it,
Right.
And
Oh,
I think
right.
similarly with ballet, it is utterly unforgiving.
Yes.
And I think that with both art forms, there are very simple building blocks. I mean, poets, we
Right.
work only with language. That's the mortar. That's that's everything we have. And similarly with dance and with ballet, a rather limited vocabulary with which,
Right.
the better you get, the more that you can do, and it's infinite.
Yes.
I think also the dance studio, and particularly actually even St. Mark's, some of you here know that space. It's a small wooden square. It has boundaries. And so I think that has a relationship to thinking about formalism, that within rules, how can you do anything that you want to?
That's a lovely connection. My daughter is very much into dance. I will tell her all this, trying to remember everything you say. You've also been interested in painting for a long time.
Yeah, I've never done it. I mean, I've never
I was
been
going to
able
ask you
to
if you
do
ever
it.
paint yourself, but you don't paint.
No, I don't. I mean, no.
But you've written a lot about painting. You've written very interesting criticism of painting. It's been a big part of your life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I grew up surrounded by a lot of art. My mother is also an artist, and her uncle, my great uncle, Charles Alston, a fantastic and beautiful painter whose work we grew up with and who I knew until he passed away when I was 10. So there was, artists were a part of things, and the visual arts and living in an aesthetic environment was normal for me. And I think also, and this, I mean, there's sort of no explaining it, there was always in my poetry a way that visual language and imagery just came very easily to me.
Talk about Romare Bearden.
Bearden,
He has
yes.
a huge, you've written beautifully about him. He has a huge influence on your life.
Yes, and he was someone who I knew about. So he is also a more distant relative, a cousin to Charles Alston, and someone who my mother knew when she was growing up. So we also grew up with Bearden, very early Bearden work in the house.
In the house.
That he gave my mom when...
Was it a collage?
No, early watercolor crucifixion and a Lorca bullfighter. Yeah, oil painting. So from early work from the 40s. That there's a relationship to the later work, but I would like a collage, but it's too late.
Is there some connection between collage work and poetry, your poetry?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think I found collage to be a very, very fruitful metaphor for creativity. You know, that you're always cutting and pasting and reassembling, but that there are wonderful traces of the original, of the point of origin. And I think that particularly for African American art and the African American art form of jazz as well, that is a collaged practice, a referential practice that makes something new in the present space of the work of art.
Did he tell you not to become an artist?
Bearden?
Yes.
Well, it's so, by the time you have really prepared, I'm tripping.
I've been listening to your phone calls for months.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so when I was in college...
What's that like to be told by this famous artist, don't become an artist?
He didn't quite say that,
Okay.
but he said something better, which I've said a version of it, but not as meanly as he said it. So I looked him up in the phone book because, you know, the families weren't in touch at that point, and I was learning of his work. And he had a studio on Canal Street, and I called, and he picked up the phone, which I've done that with a few people in that when I was in college. I thought, well, I'll just call.
That's the journalist's secret.
I met James Vanderzee that way, did the last interview with him before he passed away. I just called.
Yep.
And then just said, well, could I come? Sure.
It's all about showing up, isn't
That's
it?
right. That's right. It really is. And so Bearden, he said, it's hard. And it isn't for everyone. Everyone doesn't get to do it. Everyone's not supposed to do it. You're only supposed to do it if you have to do it. And you will know if you must do it. And what I quite like about that is, you know, being creative, it's wonderful when anybody is creative and when anybody finds a way to, I would be happy if everybody wrote poems. That's great. But that is different from committed artistic practice.
Yes.
And I can't tell anybody to keep doing that. If you have to do it,
you felt you had to do it.
I felt I had to do it. And you have to also feel like nothing could untether you from it. Because it's not a, you know, career choice. I mean, it's not like you go to law school and then at the end,
you're a poet.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, you have to want to do it.
Right. Right. Let's talk about race.
Shall we?
Shall we? Mm. You can tell from my dark skin that we're at an awkward point, I think, in American culture on this issue. You have a fascinating poem called "Race" in the Antebellum Dream book. It begins with a story of a great uncle who made the decision to pass. An act of betrayal, an act of deception at the same time. Can you read that?
Yes, absolutely. There we go. Race. Sometimes I think about Great Uncle Paul, who left Tuskegee, Alabama to become a forester in Oregon, and in so doing became fundamentally white for the rest of his life, except when he traveled without his white wife to visit his siblings, now in New York, now in Harlem, USA, just as pale-skinned, as straight-haired, as blue-eyed as Paul, and black. Paul never told anyone he was white, he just didn't say that he was black, and who could imagine an Oregon forester in 1930 as anything other than white? The siblings in Harlem each morning ensured no one confused them for anything other than what they were, black. They were black. Brown-skinned spouses reduced confusion. Many others have told and not told this tale. When Paul came east alone, he was as they were, their brother. The poet invents heroic moments where the pale black ancestor stands up on behalf of the race. The poet imagines Great Uncle Paul in cool, sagey groves, counting rings in redwood trunks. Imagines pencil markings in a ledger book, classifications. Imagines a sidelong look from an ivory spouse who is learning her husband's caesuras. She can see silent spaces, but not what they signify. Graphite markings in a forester's code. Many others have told and not told this tale. The one time Great Uncle Paul brought his wife to New York, he asked his siblings not to bring their spouses. And this is where the story ends. Ivory siblings who would not see their brother without their telltale spouses. What a strange thing is race, and family, stranger still. Here a poem tells a story about race.
Mm. I love your critical work, and your poems about race are insistent and unsettling in the best possible way.
Thank you.
What a strange thing is race. I mean, I feel very uncomfortable bringing it up. I feel like I might say something unintentionally offensive or presumptuous. It's difficult for us still to talk about it, even though we're all good people. We all, everyone here, I'm sure, is fighting for social justice in one way or another. What a strange thing is race. We all agree that racism is bad. We all want it to we all agree that it's destructive. But there's a kind of hypersensitivity among good liberals that keeps us all sort of muted, I think. And I want to try and break through that for the moment. You have a poem called Haircut.
Mm-hmm.
Can you read that?
Sure.
It's about a woman getting her hair cut in Harlem.
Why did you choose that one?
It's a poem very rooted in a place, in a very physical experience of shampooing and cutting and styling among African Americans. And then it has a turn in the poem that I want to talk about.
Okay.
This is not my turf.
Okay. Haircut. It's a prosy poem. I get off the IRT in front of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture after riding an early Amtrak from Philly to get a haircut at what used to be the Harlem Y Barbershop. It gets me in at 10 to 10. Waiting, I eat fish cakes at the Pam Pam and listen to the ladies call out orders. Bacon biscuit twice, scrambled fried, over easy grits, country sausage on the side. Hugh is late. He shampoos me, says, "I can't remember, girlfriend, are you tender-headed?" From the chair, I notice the mural behind me in the mirror. I know those overlapped sepia shadows, a Renaissance rainforest, Aaron Douglas. Hugh tells me he didn't use primer and the chlorine eats the colors every day. He clips and combs, and I tell him how my favorite Douglas is called Building More Stately Mansions, and he tells me how fly I'd look in a salt and pepper do, how he trained in Japan. Clip, 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 clip. I imagine a whoosh each time my hair lands on the floor and the noises of small brown mammals. I remember my father. He used to get his hair cut here, learned to swim in the caustic water, played pool and basketball. He cuts his own hair now. My grandfather worked 75 years in Harlem, building more stately mansions. I was born 2 blocks away, and then we moved. None of that seems to relate to today. This is not my turf, despite the other grandfather and great-aunt who sewed hearts back into black chests after Saturday night stabbings on this exact corner. The great-uncle who made a mosaic down the street, both grandmothers. What am I always listening for in Harlem? A voice that says, "This is your place too," as faintly as the shadows in the mural? The accents are unfamiliar. All my New York kin are dead. I never knew Fats Waller, but what do I do with knowing he used to play with a ham and a bottle of gin atop his piano? Never went to Olivia's House of Beauty, but I know Olivia, who lives in St. Thomas now, and who exactly am I anyway, finding myself in these ghostly Douglas shadows while real ghosts walk around me, talk about my stuff in the subway, yell at me not to butt the line, beg me for my money. What is black culture? I read the writing on the wall on the side of the Y as I always have. Harlem plays the best ball in the world. I look in the mirror and see my face in the mural with a new haircut. I am a New York girl. I am a New York woman. I am a fly girl with a new haircut in New York City in a mural that is dying every day.
Thank you. I find that a very unsettling poem.
Why and where?
this is not my turf, she suddenly says. There's that sense of alienation that she has among people that she really wants to belong to, really feels that she should.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, well, I won't speak for others. I've always had the idea of a Valhalla, of a point of origin. You know, I've said sometimes that in my imagination, you know, Harlem is like back to Africa, you know, but sometimes that shifts, and that's Jamaica, you know. I mean, I think this idea of what are your roots and how do you relate to them and how do you connect that to who you are in the present, and what are the presumptions that come with going into that space and saying, hi, I'm back,
Yes.
I'm here.
Yes.
You know, and I think that, so there's a lot of self-consciousness about being the poet, being the artist, and having to step back and say, who am I here?
Yes, how are you being defined by these people?
Well, or what presumptions do I
Right.
do I bring? And I think that that's the job of the poet as well, is to walk a little lightly and listen.
Right. Your poem, Amistad, which we'll talk about in a minute, ends with these short lines. And where now, and what now, the black-white space. What is the black-white space?
What indeed? That section is called The Last Quatrain, and it refers, or it alludes to a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, The Last Quatrain of the Ballad of Emmett Till. So she's written this incredible long poem that comes before from the perspective of the white woman who said that Emmett Till whistled to her and thus set into motion his lynching, his murder. And so she, in Gwendolyn Brooks's imagination, is dissembling under the weight of what she has caused in the poem. It's an amazing, amazing poem. And then after that, it's a long poem, this very, very short poem. Emmett's mother is a pretty thing, the tint of pulled taffy. She sits in her kitchen drinking black coffee. She kisses her killed boy, and she is sorry. Chaos in the wind, that's not quite right, on a red prairie. Very spare, very simple. The last quatrain, it's not a quatrain. So it is this thing where this mother is trying to make sense of the senseless murder of her child, and no form can do it for her. No form can contain it. So there's just something very spare through which the wind blows. And so I think that in that poem, coming at the end of this long meditation on the Amistad, right, there's the idea with the black-white space, and there's also some kind of wide-open spacing in the poem that the wind blows through and doesn't try to fully come to an answer. So perhaps, I mean, this flattens it a little bit, but to say that, you know, the poem is both historical but also anachronistic in moments. I allow myself contemporary knowledge, yes, especially at the end. So I think that also there I'm saying we continue to wrangle in new ways with these questions.
Yes. Interesting, very interesting. One of the many honors you've received is the Fletcher Fellowship, which recognizes your efforts to improve race relations in this country. You've got an essay about Gwendolyn Brooks in which you refer to the responsibilities of the black poet. I want to unpack that phrase a bit. That seems like an extraordinary burden. I can't imagine a white poet, for instance, thinking of himself as a white poet or having the responsibilities of a white poet. What are the responsibilities of a black poet?
Well, you know, the essay troubles that.
Yes.
I think also there are plenty of white poets who think of themselves as having responsibilities to other people, having responsibilities to a poetry community, having responsibilities to the art form, yes, and ways that it can move around in the world. I think that
But they have the racial advantage of imagining that their whiteness is invisible or normal. They don't have to think about it.
Luckily, that sort of that's over. You know, I mean, I think that what's happening, not to say that everyone has responded to that call, right, but that's sort of not an accepted central stance, right, in American letters anymore. Yes. And I think that some of the people who stay in that stance they're bye, it's
yes,
over. You know, I mean, that's not where we are. That's not where the art form is. That's not where the community is.
Yes.
that's not where things are so much anymore. It's looking more and more obsolete, which I think is a fantastic thing.
Yes.
Obviously, but so I think that this idea of responsibility is that I think you have a responsibility to the poem, and people have gotten in trouble for that, And I think also we do have responsibilities as citizens.
Yes.
And I think we do have responsibilities with the tools and privileges that we have to, better the world of our neighbors in some kind of way. So do you choose to do that with your poems, or do you choose to do that other ways? And if you do it with your poems, how do you also, how are you reverent about making the poem without thinking about everybody and what they might think of it?
Let's talk about history.
Mm-hmm.
You doing okay out there? Do you want to stand up? Let's stand up. My wife's a high school teacher, says kids have to get up every once in a while. Stand up, stretch, resettle. We can stand up too. We doing okay?
I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Oh, good. You wanted to do that.
Yeah. And peace be with you. Okay, good. Is it too warm, or are we okay?
It's a bit warm.
They turned the air conditioner off because it's kind of noisy, they said. So, doing okay? Okay. All right. History. Your history poem, Amistad, which is just brilliant and mind-blowing. It's about a slave ship rebellion in 1839. You write in the introduction, or in an introduction, I wanted to write a black history poem that was not just about stoicism. I wanted to explore the past in the face of the aggressive ahistoricity that plagues and misnames this nation and is a tool for misleading the people. Can you unpack that really interesting phrase?
But I said it so well there.
You need it there.
I can't do any better than that, actually. That was good.
No, you gotta.
I actually really, I'm not kidding. I have nothing more to say. I wanted to write a black...
This is tough for us.
Aggressive ahistoricity?
Yeah.
Margaret Thatcher, was she good or was she heinous? All right, read the papers today. Margaret Thatcher is the most wonderful person in the whole wide world. Aggressive ahistoricity. Talk to people who grew up in Margaret Thatcher's England, okay? This is my opinion, but there is also fact to it. So, I think it's just really striking that because someone died and because there was one extraordinary thing they did, which is the first woman to lead a nation in modern Europe, that there is this almost will, as we saw with the death of Ronald Reagan, right, to tell a different story. That's not the same as not speaking ill of the dead. That's aggressive ahistoricity. So that's an example from today.
That's great. You also wrote in that introduction, the imagination can take us where history stops.
Should I just say, Margaret Thatcher said, there is no society. Just thought I'd leave you with that, but go ahead.
Another. The imagination can take us where history stops. How does it do that?
Yeah, so, I think that one of the really exciting things about working with histories that haven't been overtold is that there are wonderful challenges with a limited archive. And I think that also, there's this artistic thing that happens where, and I couldn't even tell you how to find the line, but where I don't want something to not make sense. I don't want something to be wrong historically, but at the same time, there comes a point where there are acts of imagination, and that's what you're there to do. So I think kind of walking that line and not exactly being able to see it, but feeling it is what it feels like to be writing those poems.
Could you read a passage from Amistad?
Yeah, I'll read a couple of sections. It's a long poem, so I'm happy to read a couple of sections from it. Amistad. After the tunnel of no return, after the roiling Atlantic, the black Atlantic, black and mucilaginous, after skin to skin in the hold and the picked handcuff locks, after the mutiny, after the fight to the death on the ship, after picked handcuff locks and the jump overboard, after the sight of no land and the zigzag course, after the babble which settles like silt into silence, and silence and the whack of lashes and waves on the side of the boat, after the half cup of rice, the half cup of seawater, the dry swallow and silence, after the sight of no land, after 2 daughters sold off to pay a father's debt, after Sankey himself a settled debt, after white gulf between stanzas, the space at the end, the last quatrain. Absence. In the absence of women on board, when the ship reached the point where no land mass was visible in any direction and the funk had begun to accrue, human funk, spirit funk, soul funk, who commenced the moaning? Who first hummed that deep sound from empty bowels, roiling stomachs, from back of the frantically thumping heart? In the absence of women, of mothers, who found the note that would soon be called blue, the first blue note from one bowel, one throat, joined by dark others in gnarled harmony? Before the head rag, the cast iron skillet, new blue awaited on the other shore, invisible, as yet unhummed. Who knew what note to hit or how? In the middle of the ocean, in the absence of women, there is no deeper deep, no bluer blue. And then one more. This is, or maybe 2 more. This is education. In 1839, to enter university, the Yale men already knew Cicero, Dalzell's Graeca Minora, then learned more Latin prosody, styles on astronomy, Dana's mineralogy. Each year they named a class bully who would butt heads with sailors in town. The first foreign heathen ever seen, Ubakaya, arrived from Hawaii in '09. The most powerful telescope in America was a recent gift to the school, and through it they were first to see the blazing return of Halley's Comet. Ebenezer, Peter, Mason, and Hamilton Lanphier Smith spent all their free time at the instrument, observing the stars, their systems, their movement and science and magic, pondering the logic of mysteries that twinkle. Some 40 years before, Banneker's eclipse predicting charts and almanacs had gone to Thomas Jefferson to prove that nature has given our brethren talents equal to other colors of men. Benjamin Banneker, born free, whose people came from Guinea, who taught himself at 22, the same age as the graduates, to carve entirely from wood a watch which kept exquisite time, accurate to the blade sharp second. And then finally, translator, James Covey. So there was a Yale professor who, and I was really interested in this as a Yale story, having gone to school there and having taught there for a long time. He came to the prison on the New Haven Green where the Amistad captives were held, and of course they didn't speak English, and he was desperate to find a way and have his students find a way to help them translate so they could tell their story in court. And eventually this professor went to, Josiah Willard Gibbs, went to the docks in New York where he found someone who eventually served as the translator. So, translator, James Covey. I was stolen from Mendeland as a child, then rescued by the British ship Buzzard and brought to Freetown, Sierra Leone. I love ships and the sea, joined this crew of my own accord, set sail as a teen, now resupplying in New York Harbor. When the white professor first came to me, babbling sounds, I thought he needed help until Weta, my mother's 6, hooked my ear, and I knew what he was saying, and I knew what he wanted in an instant. For we had heard wild tales of black pirates off New London, the captives, the low black schooner like so many ships, an infinity of ships fatted with Africans, men, women, children, as I was. Now it is my turn to rescue. I have not spoken Mende in some years, yet every night I dream it, or silence. To New Haven, to the jail, to my people. Who am I now, this them, not them? We burst with joy to speak and settle the tale. We killed the cook who said he would cook us. They rubbed gunpowder and vinegar in our wounds. We were taken away in broad daylight. And in a loud voice, loud as 1,000 waves, I sing my father's song. It shakes the jail. I sing from my entire black body.
I didn't know you were a playwright, but it makes perfect sense from your poems.
Ah, well, thanks. I want to write some more plays. It's hard, but what I've written has been in verse. So I thought, let me start off doing something I know how to do.
You call these persona poems?
Yeah, they are. I mean,
They could be dramatic monologues on stage.
Yeah, sure. And those are sometimes the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right. Some of your most famous poems have been with these persona poems, particularly the Venus Hottentot. Am I saying
exactly,
it right?
Yes.
Hottentot. Can you read one of those? Or can you read that poem?
Well, why don't you know what? I'd rather actually.
Or anything you'd like.
Well, no, I'm only mindful of time, and it's a little bit of a longer one.
Any persona poem.
Okay.
Or any poem you'd like.
Or any poem. Okay. Persona. You know what? I'll get to that. But why don't I first? I marked a little group of Washington poems.
Yes,
how would that be? Okay. So this is my neighborhood. And I first grew up at 9th and C Southeast, so this is really, 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 really exactly my neighborhood. And then 512 A Street Southeast. Washington, and this poem is about exactly this time of year, although not a day as hot as this. I started my day in New Haven, Connecticut in a coat. But I like this better. Washington Etude. After rain, mushrooms appear in the park, but you cannot eat them. 1967, the year of the locust. They come to Northwest Washington by millions, and for days I crunch shed husks beneath my feet. They didn't come to Capitol Hill. They were in Northwest. There was like some science reason for that. As they rattle and hiss their rage from the trees. Baby teeth bite baby onion grass and honeysuckle nipples, tiny tongue balancing the clear, sweet drops. I am a hummingbird, a cat who laps cream from a bowl. Dandelions are yellow one day, white the next. A mud puddle surrounded by brambles and blackberries is where God lives. Buttercups under my chin tell me all I need to know. Nothing blue occurs naturally in Washington, someone says, and I believe it. I'm put to bed when it's still light and hear other children playing out my window. Watch daylight bow, regard the flare of blooming stars, the cicadas' maraca. So never let anyone tell you that growing up in the concrete jungle that you can't be a total nature girl. That's my nature. That's a nature poem for me. Then this is called Frank Willis. Many of you know. I always have to ask. Raise your hand if you know who Frank Willis is. You know who Frank Willis is. Frank Willis was the guard, African-American guard, who found the tape on the door at the Watergate headquarters, and thus a presidency fell. And this poem, I mean, these poems are written over the years, so I was younger when I wrote this. There's a little reference to an age I am not. Frank Willis. I am in the 4% of adults 18 to 29 who told George Gallup they know a lot about Watergate. Watergate was the building near the Howard Johnsons where we'd go when school let out for summer and eat clam strips. Watergate was where we stopped in carpool one year to fetch the sickly boy for day camp, where I danced in toe shoes to the Beach Boys in shame. Growing up in Washington, I rode D.C. Transit, knew senators, believed the Washington Monument was God's pencil because my friend Jennifer said so, never went to the Jefferson Memorial, climbed the stone rhino at the Smithsonian, cursed tourists, took exquisite phone messages for my father, a raceman who worked for the government. I held his scrawled hate mail to the light. I don't care now that Chuck Colson has a prison ministry or that G. Gordon Liddy ate a rat. The summer I was 11, Watergate was something I watched with my grandmother on TV like the best soap opera, but also like something she would have called Civic, the things you had to know. Today, in some way, I somehow care that Frank Willis lives with his mother, without employ, was arrested for stealing a $12 pair of sneakers, told Jet it was a total mix-up. Somehow know there is meaning in Jet's tending the fate of this man who saw the tape on the office door latch. Cog, cog, cog in the wheel of history. Frank Willis in Jet these years later, like the shouted spray paint on an empty garage in my parents' back alley. Aaron Canaday, his name alone enough. And then a sentence, a song. Slick was hero. So that's Washington.
Nice. Well, I think, let's see. You've written a lot of different forms. There are very formal sonnets, there are free verse, there's prose poems, as you mentioned. When an idea comes to you, does it come like two sides of a page with its form, or does the form come later after you've worked it out?
Yeah, so the only poetry teacher I ever had was Walcott.
Yes.
He's a strict formalist,
Okay.
very strict, and that's how he teaches you.
How are you able to develop your style?
So first book, as with many first books, was dutiful is not the word, but it was an apprentice book.
Okay.
In the sense that I was trying different things I'd learned,
Right.
and trying to make a book of that. And then I was very aware in the second book, with poems like Haircut, actually, of lines breaking open, that there were other ways to do this, and that actually some of the lessons that you learn, some of the tricks that you have from strict formalism are also a part of your toolkit when you're working in different forms.
Right.
That there's always a shape, but it just might not be a historically recognizable
Right.
shape.
Might be your shape, some shape you
Well, but I
invent.
mean, but something with a sense of integrity and
Right.
resolution,
Yes.
or else it doesn't hold together.
Right.
That's the aim, at least. That also is something like end rhyme, which I played around with a little bit more in the first book. A lot of those rhymes moved internally, so there's still an ear to the way that rhyme is part of what we do. It's the music. It's part of how ideas and thoughts are bound together. But it can be as powerful a tool if you use it internally in the line. It can still be very muscular and really, really, really work.
I can see
So
that.
I didn't think of these things consciously, like I'm going to try this now. It was just part of continuing to work and see different possibilities. And I think also it's good to come out of that apprenticeship and say, okay, well, let me do that another way and not think about the teacher.
Right, create your own space. Exactly, right. I think we're winding down. I just want to ask, skipping through here. Some of your poems, and of course your inauguration poem, Praise Song for the Day, echo African prayers. How does your own faith and your own church background affect your verse?
Not much church background, except dancing in St. Mark's Church. So we'll take that.
But there are references to spirituality in your poems. The title of this collection, for instance.
Absolutely. Why don't I read that poem? That's a poem that comes from a young adult book that I wrote with Marilyn Nelson called Miss Crandall's School for Young Ladies and Little Misses of Color. And that's a persona poem, too, so I knew we'd get to one. Prudence Crandall was this... Marilyn Nelson at the time was the Poet Laureate of Connecticut, and she said that what she wanted to do with her Poet Laureateship was to have a project of writing particularly African American history in Connecticut in poems. So she just said, let's do something together. Are you interested in Prudence Crandall? And actually, I was interested in Prudence Crandall, who taught young black girls.
A white woman who
taught black girls. And
against the law, or against the
well,
society.
they made laws to keep her from teaching them, and eventually burned her school down. And that was when she gave up. But she was an extraordinary woman, and her students were extraordinary. And so we wrote alternating sonnets in this book. And so this is Allegiance. And what Marilyn told me that was great was she said, young adults can read anything we write.
Oh. You didn't feel restrained by the audience.
That was what made me able to do it. She said, come on, 13, they can read anything. That's what a young adult is. So that was wonderful to think that these books could be marketed to those people, and you reach a whole much wider audience of librarians and teachers and educators. It's fantastic.
Yes.
The book makes
For
its
them
way
too.
around.
Yes.
But, you give them something real. So, Allegiance. Teacher is bewildered when packages and letters come from far to say how brave, how visionary, how stare down the beast is Prudence Crandall of Canterbury. Work, she says, there is always work to do, not in the name of self, but in the name, the water clarity of what is right. We crave radiance in this austere world, light in the spiritual darkness. Learning is the one perfect religion, its path correct, narrow, certain, straight. At its end, it blossoms and billows into vari-colored polyphony. the sweet infinity of true knowledge. And with this poem, Rob, that was such a lovely thing that you said about how I brought myself to tears in that reading. But, you know, sometimes you listen to yourself and you think, I believe that, or I feel that. I said that how I meant it. And that even if you're working within persona, that sometimes it is something that you yourself believe. So here, working within persona, I find that as I listen to myself read, learning is the one perfect religion. I always think I believe that. And that's me, even though it's speaking through somebody else.
Well, anyone who craves radiance will find it in your work. I just think it's really, really lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for talking to me. This was such a great time.